How's it going, everybody? Good morning. When I look around this room, what's not surprising to me is that we probably collectively have a millennia of advertising experience. And as I was doing this work with Omnicom, we decided to go back and say, well, let's really think about this. Let's think about the true definition of advertising. And so if you think about that true definition, it's the audio or visual form of marketing communication that employs an openly sponsored, non-personal message to promote or sell a product or service. Now think about that just for a second. This concept of non-personal. We're sitting in a room full of digital marketers. And that concept of non-personal is a complete oxymoron. And if you think about the space today that we actually live in, we are literally sitting in an era where there's hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars of ad tech technology, where we literally can geofence a consumer down to the device. We understand their consumer journey. We understand what ad they looked at. And thanks to our connection to their credit card, we know exactly whether or not they made a purchase. In a lot of ways, we've evolved. In a lot of ways, the consumer has evolved. Imagine, as you will, it's sort of like going on a blind date where you've scrubbed through their Instagram, their LinkedIn, and you say, hey, how's it going, Steve? I see that you went to Brown University, and you were a professor at University of Virginia. And your Instagram tells me that you really love blue. Kind of creepy. He really did go to university. He was a professor. That's right. Now, the reason why this is important is that the consumer is now evolving right before our very eyes. How exactly is that changing? Well, if you think about what's happening with attention, Nick Carr wrote about this in his great book, The Shallow, where he literally said that because of digital experiences and devices, we are literally creating new neural pathways in our mind that help us consume and connect with rapid sampling data. As a result of that, our ability to actually concentrate, contemplate, and reflect are now going out the window. This notion of our transient short-term memory, as Microsoft tells us in 2012, has literally shrunk by almost 30%, from 12 seconds to 8 seconds. If that's not enough, yesterday, Laurie Sullivan of MediaPost wrote about this. This was actually covered. It doesn't matter whether you're a millennial, a Gen X, or a boomer. This whole concept of ad blocking is on the rise. In fact, eMarketer tells us that 31% of US consumers have ad blocking. And if you believe in what Apple and even Google are saying, Google, which owns about 48% of what happens on our desktop through Chrome, they are literally implementing these experiences into what we do every single day. Now, if that weren't enough, the consumer is now actually telling us 9 out of 10 that I am literally going to ignore the ads on the page. What we did is we spoke to many of them, and we kind of put together a really fun montage that we hope you enjoy. So whether you're Gabe or you're Adam or Dan, who are real people that we actually spoke to during this piece of work, the fact is consumers are changing. They're changing so much that we worked with this company called Create with Context. And what they literally did is they were a user experience consultancy, and they used eye tracking software that beamed into our eyeballs and literally tracked the eyes that we were looking at. And the green and red that you saw is exactly where the consumer was looking across thousands of publishers that they tested, or thousands of consumers across hundreds of publishers. Now, why this is important is that the consumer now is literally creating dead zones when it comes to advertising. And they actually attributed this to what they call selective exposure theory, which is connected to cognitive dissonance. When a consumer is put up against something that contrasts with what they like, they literally create defense mechanisms that bring us back to equilibrium and cognitive harmony. Now, why is this important? We just talked about the fact that our attention is literally changing. We talked about the fact that ad blocking is on the rise. there's even an evolution in the way we cognitively process advertising. And the fact is, we must start to recapture lost attention, because quite frankly, when it comes to advertising, it is personal. And as Craig Davis says so well, we must stop interrupting what consumers are interested in and really become what they are interested in. And why that's important is that the first foray into this is really sponsored content, sponsored branded content. I think Colby talked about it just a second ago. And the reason why we like it is because, quite frankly, it appeals to younger generations, from those that are 18 to 24 and 25 to 34. And why that's so remarkable is that these are the same consumers that every single one of us as publishers and advertisers are trying to get in front of. But it's much more complicated than that. This notion of native, it's more than a format. But really, what is it? So we wanted to find out. We wanted to find out the basic questions of what is it? Who does it? Where can I find it? How do I do it? And really, why should you care and why should advertisers care? And so what we do quite often is BuzzFeed worked with Omnicom Media Group, Jonathan Stewart and his team, and we used a multi-pronged approach. Basically, it's the nerdy slide to say, we spend a lot of time and a lot of money doing this work, and we hope you like it. So really, what is it? What is native advertising? When we talk to consumers, really, they aren't quite clear. Only about a quarter, or less than a quarter, 23%, actually even know what native advertising is. In fact, the younger consumer, about 30% of them actually do. And I would probably attribute that to the fact that there was a really funny clip that Jamie Oliver did around native advertising not too long ago, where he was making fun of native ads. So we don't expect the consumer to know, but every single one of us should know, right? And so what we did is we worked with advertiser perceptions, and we asked two basic questions. We said, number one, do you know what native advertising is? All of these people were director level above in brands, agencies, and publishers. The second question we asked is, if you do know, what is it? Here's an open text box. Please tell me. Now, out of 5 people, 1 would say, I don't know. Out of those 4 people, they would actually put into the box their answer. Now, what's so funny is, as a researcher, as we were going through the box, I noticed that almost 35 to 40% of those boxes were exactly the same answer. So the first thing I did with my team is we called advertiser perceptions, got them on the phone, and we yelled at them and saying, we're furious. Somebody in this room, one of us, juked the system, because we know you pay some money for people to take this survey. And so they were going back and they were looking at their data, and what they actually found is that we went to Google, we took the first definition of what is native advertising and we put it in. And that happened 35 to 40% of the time. So not even we, as an industry, can describe what it is naturally. We had to search for it. So why is this important? Because when we put this definition in front of the consumer, this comes from Sharethrough, and we really liked it, this is what we got back. Who does it and where can you find it? And it's not surprising that when you talk to these consumers, this map is really an expression of an open text box where they said, it comes from Facebook, BuzzFeed, Snapchat, Pinterest. It's a mix of what I call the 2 Ps. So when we get down to this notion of the 2 Ps, it is the platforms and the publishers. And it's a mix of those 2 Ps. Because quite frankly, when you think about the Huffington Post, the BuzzFeeds, the Googles, the YouTubes, the Facebooks, content is the hook, but platforms distribute the look. Now, who does it is an easy one, but how do I do it right? That is really getting at the heart of why native is such an important and such a complicated thing to talk about. And at the end of the day, we all know that if you got to look the part, say the part, and feel the part, then you're native. At the end of the day, it's about transparency, it's about seamless integration, and that whole concept of relevance. Now, I'm sure many in the room are saying, well, I think I know what native is. Anyone in the room love architecture? Who knows who Frank Lloyd Wright is? And who has heard of the phrase form following function? Well, I used to think that it was also form following function. But according to Frank Lloyd Wright, it's actually form and function. And it's not form following anything. form and function need to be yin and yang. And all of these ridiculous things that I'm showing you on the board are really interesting contraptions that might have function, but really lack form. That Ramen shin guard is apparently really good. And when we showed one of the folks that we worked with the cat comb, she said, hey, don't make fun of me. I actually have that comb. Now, what's so interesting about this whole notion of form and function when it comes to native advertising is you have to think about both. It's form and function. And the left side is really all about what's on the left brain, the distribution, the format, whether or not something actually gets looked at. And I had a little bit of time working at a great company, a little company called Pinterest. And when you think about the actual feed, the actual boards, what's interesting about what they do is that they look at relevancy in two ways. There's contextual relevance. A promoted pin, which is a piece of advertising content, is contextually relevant. If I love food, I get a food pin. Or number two, it's personally relevant. So that whole green and red that we were talking about, the eye tracking, I never lose my focus into that zone, that flow. There's no break. In the same way, when we take a look at what happens on BuzzFeed, this comes from 3 specific users. You can see that the green and red follows that flow, really contributing to very little dead zones. And why this is important is when you think about native, there are models when it comes to publishing that Create with Context actually gave us. This whole notion of specific placements that constrain us. So even if your advertising is within a certain space, even if it's native, you're stuck maybe next to some content that you might not like. Even when it's in the feed, you might see an openness to it, but that feed ends up helping you ignore the sides. That freedom is really at the end, where when advertising is branded content and content is branded advertising, you really benefit from that freedom. Now, why does that freedom matter? Well, quite frankly, it comes down to viewability. This slide tells us that, again, data from Create with Context, eye tracking data, not survey data, of several hundred users across a number of publishers, only 37% of ads are actually viewed, even if loaded. Whereas when we think about when advertising can be placed anywhere, specifically with native content, 68% of the time, ads are actually viewed. So while many of us are in the industry leveraging things like Moat, things like IAS, 100% needed, mind you, because of viewability, is that really an opportunity to be loaded versus an opportunity to be actually cognitively processed? That's a question we must ask ourselves. Now, we've talked about that left side. When we talk about the right side when it comes to function, it's about the transparency, the contextual engagement. It's really the softer stuff. And why that matters is when it's form but no function, what does it actually even mean? And I always like to tell this story. Any of you guys have any Asian friends? Any of you have any first generation Asian immigrant friends? All right. So if you have ever been to my house, and what you know about Asians, you know that you're going to see a couple of things in Asian American homes. You're going to see remote controls that are wrapped in saran wrap. It happens, don't know why. You're going to see chairs that are plastically covered. And for some reason, you always see glass fruit. My mom loved it. All of our friends loved it. I don't know why. And as an 8-year-old, I thought, those grapes look delicious. Those grapes look so delicious that only one of two things are going to happen if I try those amazing grapes. Either A, it tastes like real grapes, or B, it tastes like candy, because it sure feels like candy. So as an 8-year-old, I took that great form, and I bit into it, and I lost my 2 front teeth. Now, why does this matter? When you have the form but no function, consumers totally get it. And as a result of that, you get this great quote. And if you take a look at this quote and read it, it's a little small. If you don't care about form, your idea will have less chance for people to notice. It's bad because good ideas can be wasted that way. However, I'm more worried about the latter, where substance is put above or severely lacking, and people still don't realize it's because, well, the form is good. This person wasn't even talking about advertising. They were talking about art. Now, why that's important is we have to figure out then, what makes great ads when it comes to native advertising. And since this is a piece of industry research, we have a lot of folks that we can appreciate. Vice, when they talk about sports, they talk about the fact that it's not about the game or it's not about the event, it's about the actual athlete. And what they did is they worked with Samsung, and Robbie Madison, who is a dirt biker, decided, hey, I'm going to use Samsung, and I'm actually going to try to ride a 30-foot wave. And this whole notion of 51% of consumers agreeing that authenticity actually needs to be there when it comes to native ads. Also, the content has to be similar to editorial content. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody. Now, on BuzzFeed, as you know, we are a very young site with reaching about over half of millennials, 3/4 of women who are millennial, and about 2/5 of men who are. And why that's so important is that many of the things that they're going through in life are all around growing up. In fact, 9 out of 10 of these consumers tell us, we love when you give us instruction specifically on BuzzFeed. And at any given point while we were doing this research, the whole term adulting on Google search trends was highly related to the search term BuzzFeed. It fell to number 2 to 6. And so when we talk about this notion of what is connected editorially, this is a really good example with Scrubbing Bubbles.
I'll be right back. He went through my stuff.
Hey, do not use that towel. Use this.
Thank you.
Oh, come on, man.
Oy, boys are gross.
Hey.
Hey.
I got you this.
What?
Yeah, you can keep it here. It's for you to use.
Oh, okay.
No, it's not a big deal.
Yeah, but it feels like one.
Okay, a little bit.
Okay, like you, okay. Well, then I like you too, so okay. What up, gangsta?
Hello. No.
No, by all means, sir.
That was a successful bath.
Oh.
My name is Kermit.
Oh, is that how you hear him? I don't hear him like that. I always pictured him talking like, hello, I'm Kermit.
What was that?
Or what if he's like, hey, I'm Kermit from Ohio, and this is how I talk. I'm like a pretty chill dude. Oh, spray.
Thank you.
And that's a great example of why consumers say, if advertising was always like that, I would never change the channel. There's also this whole concept of alignment between the publisher and the brand. Is there a connection? And for some of the marketers out there, they might say, well, what's my connection to BuzzFeed? Which is why over our 200 handles, whether it's Nifty, Tasty, or Boldly, we have a connection for anyone that we can connect with. And obviously, Refinery29 does fashion very well. This notion of portability. Now, what's interesting is that in 2014, our founder, Jonah, he talked about this whole notion of we need to be a media distributed network. And 80% of what actually happens on BuzzFeed happens on other platforms, be it Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest. It really doesn't matter. It's not about our site. It's about where the consumer is actually headed. And 55% of consumers actually believe that. Now, we always thought it was about content and ads, and if we can sort of lift the separation of the two, that was it. But really, it's about that intricacy, and it's a lot more complicated than that. And in a lot of ways, connecting with the consumer when it comes to native advertising is a lot like a relationship. It's supposed to be hard because the connection is worth it. And as we close in this last section, why should advertisers care? Well, at the end of the day, it starts with perceptions. When we think about this perception, are we a pretender? Are we a pocketbook? Are we a friend or a pretender? And that perception actually leads to this whole notion of permission. That permission, when I'm following a publisher or I'm following a friend, it doesn't quite matter as long as that connection and that permission tells me that, hey, this publisher is allowing me in on some secrets thanks to Holiday Inn. Or Jason is talking about Google and what they're doing, and that actually interests me. That permission ultimately leads to this notion of personal receptivity. So when you take a look at how open the consumer is from what they get from the publishers, whether it's content or sponsored content, or whether it's actually a friend, again, whether it is just normal content, 74% say they notice it, versus sponsored content, what's important is that the branded content and the sponsored content is literally one and the same. And ultimately, that personal connection leads to what I call preference. 4 out of 5 say, look, I'd rather come to you and connect around this instead of watching ads that gate me to some content, because the advertising is the content that I'm seeking. And when we actually put typical video ads versus this branded content on two polar opposite ends, they are 12 times more likely to actually choose this whole notion of what native ultimately means. And that's because it's the content that they're interested in. They are open to seeing this content 3/4 of the time in travel, cooking, health, fashion, and beauty. 2/3 of the time in this second row, and half of the time in politics, quizzes, and finance. This receptivity and this openness actually leads to goodness for many publishers. Now, the fact is, when it comes to this notion of branded content and native advertising, literally it creates brand value. And what I mean by that is, if you take a look at what this brand actually did, Zyrtec, ever seen a display ad from a pharma company? I might see 1/3 of the ad, and the other third tells me that if I take this medicine, don't drive, I could die, I might suffer from depression, I might have a bad stomach ache. But what Zyrtec was able to do is take our love of animals and connect with the consumer in such a way that they literally humanized it. How do you extend the brand because of that content? And quite frankly, I love this because native advertising and branded content inspires action. Now, having worked at some pretty cool companies, whether it's Pinterest or BuzzFeed, one of the things that I've literally learned is that the next space of media and digital experiences need to move from physical to analog. It's where the entire ecosystem is going. And Peter Korn wrote an amazing book where he was at Wall Street and he decided to move to Denver, and now he runs a wood-making mill, and everyone goes there to make things with their hands. The digital needs to inspire the physical. 53% of these consumers say these ads inspire me to do something. And Tasty and Nifty, which are two powerful food brands and do-it-yourself brands on BuzzFeed, actually show that. They inspire about 50% of our consumers to actually make and do things. That's billions and billions of actual meals made every single year because of our large distribution on Facebook. And I call this a 2.5 slide. When you take a look at these native ads, and you compare them to non-skippable and full-screen video ads, you're 2 times more likely to be positive about all the things we want from consumers, but half as likely to have these negative perceptions or avoid purchasing the brand altogether. Now, this is the last case study. This is an Old Navy case study that looked at how our consumers were engaging with Old Navy. Now, why this is important is if you have been working with Millward Brown or Comscore or any of the brand agencies, you'll notice that if you get an 8-point difference between test versus control for brand favorability, it's remarkable. But more importantly than that, what if you could go to your brand and say, hey, the average time that someone spent with you was 1 minute and 17 seconds. The average view-through rate was 74%. The consumer ultimately stayed with you. So as we close in this session, who and where can you find native advertising? At day's end, content is the hook, but platforms distribute the look. How do you actually do it? It is this notion of form and function. It's supposed to be intricate because the connection is worth it. Why does it matter? Because it comes down to what I call those P's. The perception leads to permission. The permission leads to personal connectivity, and that connectivity leads to preference. Ultimately, as an industry, what exactly is this next level native? It's not a format, but it's really a philosophy towards personal advertising. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. We have a few minutes for questions if anybody has any questions.
Doug Harbrick with Kiplinger. Edwin, that's really excellent presentation. Thank you. But let me ask you, native advertising from the get-go has been just a horrible term to describe what you've elaborated on. If you had 2 words to describe native advertising and you could go back to the beginning and say what it is, can you say that, number 1? And number 2, how is this different from content marketing?
I honestly do believe in this whole notion of form and function. I think it is like art, and that was really at the crux of what we were trying to push. I think content marketing has become a bad word because we've lost the consumer connection piece of it. And it became more about the brand as opposed to the personal connection. And so all the things that we were trying to talk about in terms of principle, which is what's the alignment to your brand? What is being in the same place? This whole notion of content really is the hook, but the platform is the one that distributes the look. We were up here when the first speaker, when we were looking at what The Economist did across different platforms and how it was different. All of those things that we pay attention to means we're paying attention to the consumer, not just slapping it on and saying, this looks like the platform, I'm done. And even the way the consumer is engaging and why they're engaging on that platform, I think, is really key to understanding mindset, and tuning that content makes it more than just how we're defining sponsored content, in my opinion.
We're going to continue this in a roundtable. We're also going to have a panel coming up after the coffee break on branded content to further the discussion. Edwin Wong, great presentation. Thank you very much.